Poh, a lot has happened in the last couple of months since we did our first conversation recording with each other.
The questions you asked me, even though I had a response at the time, have been with me since our conversation. And in response, so much has kind of opened up, or I'm finding myself articulate things in ways that I haven't yet.
I'm honored, and I'm curious too. What did you find yourself thinking about after our interview?
I think it was your question around, now that I've arrived in Quebec, what am I interested to get involved in, or what am I kind of passionate about? And I remember at the time being kind of like, whatever emerges. And then after the conversation, I was thinking, that's not really quite right. Like, I do have some very clear ideas, but I guess I hadn't been asked that before. So it was the chance to start to articulate it. And what you were just saying before, Peggy, about the bike riding through Quebec and having that moment of kind of recognizing a restriction that you're experiencing in your context at that time, that just really resonated. Just before our conversation, I was thinking, how could I share that with Peggy, that I'm really interested in like noticing restrictions and then getting kind of playful with them and seeing like what creative possibilities can happen. And it's almost alarming how, when I've done this kind of exploration for myself, just how many self-imposed restrictions are there. And so now starting to kind of gently question them, or kind of look at their truth claims, has been a really, really important process, I think.
And you gave birth to not a fourth child, but a new narrative imaginings. What is that?
Yeah. So it's in the kind of spirit of rethinking how I come to practice. The platform is called Patreon, kind of assists independent and freelancing kind of artists and creatives to have a kind of more stable, steady support or income while kind of creating at the same time. I was thinking, instead of like creating material over here and then once it's polished and shiny, then presenting it, what would it be like to be kind of like showing all the intimate aspects of creating? And that's often the conversations that I'm a part of with people, whether it's a project, a practice, and by practice, that's a really kind of open definition. This was like the chance to show these conversations as they're happening, and to be unpacked by the people who are at the center of the conversation. I've been thinking about the restriction that I experience around writing like journal articles, or writing in a form where it is long past the moment. And often I feel like I'm speaking on behalf of people rather than with people. And so this is kind of trying an experiment in shifting that so that it can be a little bit more like response-based, moment by moment. This is kind of the ideas, and like making the co-production of knowledge visible, how does it actually emerge, and what shape does it look like, and when is it clunky, and when do we go back and need to review it? So I'm hoping by sharing this that people can, not in an extractive way, but in a community kind of collective way, kind of engage with their own practice and processes through the sharing with others.
It's my hope not only for people to join you, as I and others are, but also that it will inspire others to think of themselves as creatives and thinking in a way of kind of making dreams come true and how that can happen. Did you know that you had this dream, or how did it emerge?
It's been like emerging on account of experience, like by doing the film work with Gabrielle, the director. by kind of having therapeutic conversations in the film. So, the people that we're in conversation with kind of being at the center in those. How can we keep kind of making that visible? Do we have to just wait for, the film that comes along or the conference that comes along? But what if it could be a more like daily practice? What could it be like if people are, kind of feeling a bit isolated or struggling in their own relationship with practice or process or project, and being able to just come online and listen to something or hear a couple of questions or, and then kind of see what sparks or emerges from that.
Over the years, I've heard so many people who have been studying narrative therapy for a while define themselves as I'm narrative oriented, but I don't know that I really do it right. And I think back to when Michael White was alive, he would not want that. He used to always say, "This is the way I do it." There's certain ethics and practices I believe in, but it's really up to each of us to create this in our own voice, in our own way. And I am remembering what you said in your earlier conversation about being very drawn to work that integrates in mindfulness practices and embodied work. And I just love seeing the way you bring that into your work and your thinking here. And I think that, among other things, can help inspire others to, it's okay to do it my way. Years ago when I was starting in practice, and I have a dear friend, Lee Monroe, who said at the time, it was when feminist family therapy was coming into vogue. These relational ways of working, I've been doing those a long time. I just don't tell my supervisor.
Oh, that's gorgeous. But, I really appreciate that. And in what you're sharing, I think, I struggle with calling the practice like mindfulness or embodied. I've been thinking a lot about and reading a lot from Indigenous women's perspectives on feminism. In my practice, I am responding to a mind-body split, that's kind of emerged from the presence of lots of different ideas and discourses. But Indigenous women remind me also that it's not just the mind-body split, it's the earth mind-body split. And somehow recently kind of coming home to being able to stand in my position, which is a mixed race position, which is a in-between position a lot of the times. I think that has really kind of sparked a way of coming to practice that is about all those unsaid, invisibilized parts, and how we can be more kind of like bringing a community or collective or group kind of spirit or inclusivity with the practices.
It's named something, it starts to become rigidified. And also we have interpretations we, inevitably put on, thinking other people are thinking the same and they're not. What I love from the way you're describing your work and your vision is we're always in a state of becoming.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And by waiting until you have the polished, finished product to show, we're kind of adding to that illusion that you've arrived, whereas the creative energy is in the in-between often.
Yes.
And in the collaboration, in the, like we don't, I, like when you say to me that conversation influenced you, I'm like, really, what did I say? But I know how I know how you influenced me, So we need each other in those ways.
Because sometimes I feel like I'm bringing something that's quite slippery or unformed as an offering, but actually I'm quite comfortable in that liminal, unstructured spaces. Once something's completed or polished and then it's put out, I'm more interested in like, and then what happens in that next moment or around it. Or when our film was released, it went through like the official film industry release, you know, which was, there's so many rituals and cultures around how films go to festivals. But for Gabrielle and myself, that was like an industry expected ritual, but we actually found ways to acknowledge those moments of kind of, it was just another chapter in the project or the process. It was never the end for us.
You know, as I mentioned, we're working on now 3 different courses, and I feel like they're on the spectrum. There's a lot in between. One is embodying conversations, narrative therapy, trauma, and the effective turn.
Lovely.
And the other 2 are the first 2 in a series with David Epstein that are about what he's calling contemporary narrative therapy. When David and Michael first kind of founded narrative therapy, the intention was maybe to set some scaffolding for this, some ethics, but it was for a spirit of adventure in the work. It was never meant to be that there's, you know, a certain way to do it. David would say, no, we want to ask very specific questions that then and bring people to territory they've never thought of before.
Yes.
You know? So you're embodying that, you know, that's what you're describing is, you know, as I hear it, like, let's go to these places together and do some co-researching about what we're discovering along the way.
Yes, yes. And let's dissolve some of those like artificial or imposed borders between fields of practice. People have said to me, oh, you know, I'd love to do that work, or I'd love to try that exercise, but I don't actually work as this, or, you know, my practice is actually like, you know, pressing flowers on the weekend or something. And it's just interesting how people immediately devalue the practice.
Exactly.
And actually, some of the most exciting conversations that I'm a part of is people who've come thinking that they want to have therapeutic conversations, and in the end are taking the lead in like forming particular ideas or forming particular exercises that can be shared with others. Like when you talked about noticing restriction, and then you were saying like reauthoring was kind of born from that, if I understood you correctly. I guess, yeah, the same spirit. That's the question that I kind of offered to people who are coming onto Patreon is, by choosing to come here, what are you departing from? And I'm thinking a lot about that for myself. Like, what am I choosing to depart from? Like it brings a lot of possibility, that question, for me.
And what do you feel, Poh, that you're departing from in moving in this direction?
I feel like I'm departing from a imposed practice of needing to define myself in kind of split off or categorized ways. Growing up, I was often raised white, or like expected to be white. And so in some ways, I was always kind of like, okay, in this context, I can show a little bit of my Chinese side, or no, I can't. And so I'm like, okay, what if I can resist this kind of being formed into a single description of myself. So that's one practice that I would say I'm departing from, and also departing from the expectation that I come to practice in the ways that people have before me, or that people are alongside me as well. For me, it departs from being invisible or kind of just slinking along the sidelines. So that's a kind of uncomfortable departure to be more visible in my practice. Yeah. Does that question ring a bell for you in terms of departures?
Yeah. There is an added piece to becoming more visible. And on one hand, we're encouraging the people who work with us, that's, to have a sense of agency, to move more into their preferred ways of being, to hold themselves and to be generous and offering who they are. And it's probably good for us, or I'll speak for myself, to just remember that there's also an underbelly to that there's a kind of, and especially, I don't know, I'm sure it's true everywhere, but especially in the US, where we're in such a polarized, politically challenging times, that when you step out, you have to be prepared for, that not everyone's going to agree with what you say, or, it's not just sometimes there's some hard edges to it.
Yes.
So, and yet, if we don't, the alternative is not what we want either.
Yeah, that we might not ever come to that hard edge.
We come to this at different kind of phases of our lives, like in a way that there's always space. You're discerning. There's a lot of discernment with what you're saying. But I think unless you are a lot, and you might be clearer, wiser than I was, about my time, I had a sense that there was time for everything, like I didn't have, even raising children, or, I didn't really understand that. Now I am aware everywhere I look, the answer seems to be about what do you really want to do, and what do you want to let go of, to make space for what you want to do.
Yes.
So there's like a conserving of energy. There's a conserving of who I want to spend my time with, and how do I want to spend my time? And that, I think, maybe it's the timing is everything. Maybe I could say, wow, what would have happened if I'd done that sooner? But I think it's just an evolution, really.
So if you were to term that in a departing from?
It would be a departing from trying to do it all.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And just because you can do it doesn't mean that it's like a given that you might want to keep doing it. It's not a question about your ability or capacity, like I think that there's endless potential and possibility in what we can create. Yeah. But there's almost like that discernment that you spoke about, and that things do change and shift and are contextual.
And where are we? Like, what is my contribution? What is yours? And having started to step into the world that we've been creating with reauthoring teaching, what is there anything that stands out to you there, or that you're drawn to?
Actually, I was drawn to reauthoring teaching long before I arrived in Quebec, but I was kind of witnessing from a position a bit further away. But it's really in alignment with the way that I wish to come to practice. And it's been, from the outside, seeing different names and people pop up, and like fragments of the practice that is most precious to them in each moment. There's a sense that there's not like one or two key people, that there's really a sense of when it resonates for someone, they appear and they share, and then they might toddle off and another person comes. So the question that comes up for me is, what could I contribute to reauthoring?
I think we're just beginning to discover that. And I'm just so glad to be working together and wholeheartedly welcome you into this world that we're in together, and vice versa. I feel welcome into yours. So
yeah. Thank you, Peggy.